Advancing with watercolor. Today we're going to talk about developing edges with watercolor and using a motif from Paris again, Place de Vosges, which is a wonderful area towards the Bastille in the Marais. Anyway, we're going to be focusing on a rainy day scene and using this as a means of demonstrating how we use different edges, soft edges, hard edges, broken edges, to convey a number of things. Convey moisture in the air, rain, reflections, to convey awnings, umbrellas, figures, to convey a wet pavement and glittering light on the tops of objects. We use all of these types of edges in our painting, and there's another video which explains this in greater detail that I have attached a link to in the description of this video. You can see how we generate these types of edges in that video through a drill. Anyway, today we're using it to create a motif of a rainy day. And one of the things that we notice on a rainy day is there's an abundance of soft edges, whether it be in the clouds or objects in the distance or reflections or this or that. So watercolor is really well suited to creating these types of edges, wet on wet technique, dry into wet technique, to create soft edges and rounded shapes and disappearing shapes. We use the media. We take full advantage of the media to generate these types of shapes. As you can see, I'm developing the scene very quickly using a series of grays, starting at the top of the paper with the distant rooftops, chimney tops that are so common in Paris. As I came down in that wash, I isolated a few awnings on the right-hand side, and below that isolated the windshields of a few cars that are lining the street, and then moved towards the left-hand side by creating a graded wash in the foreground and fed that up into the building on the left-hand side. What I'm trying to generate in this initial wash is a feeling of soft distance. I added absolutely nothing to the sky. I'm using the white of the paper in this case. But as I come down into the buildings, a little bit of yellow ochre, a little bit of a cool gray called lavender on top of that, and as the wash comes down into the lower section of the paper, it's getting darker and cooler and creating this feeling of misty light up through the middle of the painting. This is what I will build the rest of the painting on top of that after this stage dries, and create a real feeling of depth by adding some strong darks against these soft, distant lights. So I need to let the painting dry, because now I want to use harder edges. I need some definitive marks, and I'm starting with my center of interest practically. It's going to be right through this area. I'm developing a couple of figures with a smaller brush, but very keen on capturing those shapes, the shapes of the figures as silhouettes, darks against a light background. Not too much in the way of color. I'm counting on that later. A couple of figures coming through under an umbrella and lining them up with care, because they need to be in proximity in terms of scale, in terms related to the cars. They can't be too large, they can't be too tall. And then I'm going to move outward into the painting using a dry brush, where I've taken a lot of water out of the brush, a lot of liquid, and make a mark that kind of skids along the surface of my rough paper. Rough paper is ideal for creating a dry brush technique because of its exaggerated texture, and that in combination with very little pigment, very little liquid on the brush, I'm able to get some very nice rough marks, broken marks. You can see I'm using that here in these pulls, where the mark is actually broken. It's if you saw it in life, you would see a definite connection top to bottom with these supports for the awning, but a broken mark makes it look a little more animated and also makes it work with this type of wet day feel. So this painting is a combination of soft edges. You can see that a lot through the cars and in the sidewalk, with some dry brush and hard edges added on top of that. And then towards the end of the painting, I'll actually take a wet brush and soften things out a little further. So this painting has a strong reference to different types of edges. That's the primary exercise that we're trying to communicate today, or trying to experience today, is how we can use different edges to create this misty, rainy day in Paris. So I continue working with the smaller brush, developing outward from my center of interest. This is not always the way, the sequence that I take, but today it seemed appropriate to build up the background first, the periphery first, in a very soft manner, and then bring in the figures and the main center of interest and work back out towards the periphery, top and bottom, front and top, with marks that are connected. In other words, you can see how my figure connects to the left side, and how those left-sided marks extend upward and connect the top and bottom of the painting, at least on the left side. The reflections that I'm adding now connect these darks to the bottom. It's important, I feel, to find ways, sometimes very creative ways, to connect darks which might seem isolated if you didn't connect them. And they might feel cut out and pasted down if you don't connect them. So finding a way to connect the darks or lights in a painting is another strategy to keep the composition sound, to keep the relationships in the painting feeling connected and not isolated, and to keep the center of interest really working as a focal point. So the dog that I've painted is rather isolated. Coming forward, it's a little darker than the figures, and this is a key part of the painting. I like to put in our four-legged friends once in a while. I feel you see them in our daily life, and we should be able to include them in our paintings. And in this case, he's kind of got the major position in the painting. He's leading the way right out of the painting. I continue to build into the darks. As they dry, I felt that it's paling a little too much. I want to bring in a little more feeling of closeness, bring these figures a little closer to us. And we can do that by exaggerating the darks in front of them and above them. The cars certainly needed a little bit of detail, though really not too much. It's a temptation to bring in every bumper and every side mirror, every tire rim, and so on, but these cars are sort of supplemental. They help the painting, they give it a context, but in truth we don't want them to take away too much attention. The white shapes that are left will get a little spot of color, a little dry brush to tone them down, as will the awnings in the background. And I'll do that later in the painting when I feel the adjustment can be measured against the center of interest. I think this is a helpful way to do it, because once you establish the center of interest, the main focal area in the painting, you can balance the periphery, you can balance the minor elements against that, and add a little bit of color here and there to do that, to balance the scene. But it's at this point we're using a little dry brush now on the windows that move towards the back. We'll continue to do that in small bits. We'll add some small details to the foreground. I intend to put feeling of pavers, which are helpful on a rainy day, especially when we see these strong reflections to give them more of a transparency. The idea of pavers or little marks describing how the stones fit together through the pavement is a great way to do that. A little color to the awnings, not much, but enough to kind of push it back into the painting another degree. You see some things are kind of popping out, whites that have been left as a result of the brushwork that I was using to create the buildings. Those we can adjust quite easily by putting a little bit of color on top of them. And as the painting dries and it starts to get a little more finish to it, I'll add those colors. Right now I'm using a little bit of a wet brush to soften some edges on our main figure along the curb side. On top of the cars you see some figures moving in and out. I'm softening those as well. I really want the distance to recede, and one surefire way to do that is using a few strong darks in the foreground as things get close, and really keeping it pale and soft in the background. So a few of these pavers coming through our reflections. They're also great ways to lead into the painting, and they help to give a feeling of they help to feel the surface to feel a little wetter. Given a tongue to my dog to pull it forward. We'll see if that stays. I feel that we can add things, and if we don't like them, it's easy enough to take out or to soften or to adjust. But I put also a little bit of red, which is a prominent color in the umbrella in the background, into the dog and into the face of one of my main figures next to the under the awnings. Working with small dry brush at this point. The paper is very dry. I can apply marks, and with a dry brush, which means in essence a lot of control. We can really control these marks, and I'm making an effort to leave them as sort of broken marks and not really connect them overly much. I feel it is getting a little much like a grid. So what I do in this case is I'll take a wet brush, as you saw, and just soften some of that out and blur some of those marks, leave some other marks. And I feel that this combination gives me the balance that I want. Some highlights on our figures to give that feeling of overhead light, and especially on the distant figures or the umbrella or the hat of one of the near figures. And here's the finished piece, at least finished so far. I may add another red to our canine friend, but basically the scene is done. The great center of interest with that light shine off of the pavement and then dark figures on top of that, and also controlling the edges towards the back of the painting with a lot of wet on wet and dry into wet.